To venture prediction about religion in this most sacred city is to risk a thunderbolt. I shall address three themes, however: secularization, New Age spirituality, and toleration. First, secularization. Secularization must be distinguished from secularism, a political program aimed at limiting the role of religions in public life. Secularization describes a sociological process that was taken 4 decades ago to be a straight line whereby religions lose adherents in a world increasingly ruled by technological rationality. A more refined version of secularization theory notices that in the advanced industrial countries, mainstream Christian observance, especially church attendance, has sharply declined. The United States presents an apparent exception. Explanations include the widespread belief in the destiny of the American people, the mutual aid that enables immigrant communities to prosper in cities, and the social services provided by the churches to make up for a defective welfare state. Yet probably the USA is following the same trend as Europe, but with a delay of some decades. In any case, ethnic minorities in the USA, as in Europe, are not following the secularization path, and having in general a rather higher birth rate, they slow down the trend. Moreover, even among the apparently secularized, religion leaves a strong residual legacy. And whereas in the so-called West, younger generations are on the whole progressively more secularized than their elders, this generalization may not hold for the Muslim world at large. So that's clear then, unless we look at the very concept of religion more closely with an anthropological lens. We should ask ourselves what the social study of religion would look like if it had been defined and pioneered not in the West, but in China, for instance, with Confucianism or Taoism rather than the Abrahamic monotheisms as the baseline for comparison, and without our conventional assumption that religion is a set of institutions and beliefs distinct from other aspects of life. One can think instead of a diffuse religious field that can be identified in every society, including those that are apparently highly secularized, but varying in its strength and its relationship to other fields such as economics and law. If religion is thrown out of the door, it will come back through the window, in a myriad cults and therapeutic systems, but also in political religions such as fascism, and in ideological movements such as environmentalism. To take the example of communism, the personality cult of Mao Zedong, especially during the Cultural Revolution, was, I argue, a religion in the strict sense, whose collapse has left China with a very serious ideological vacuum. Thank you. And I've published a short study of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, considered as a faith-based organization. Next, New Age spirituality. Thank you. A stimulating model for understanding contemporary religion has been offered by the French sociologist Raphaël Liogier in his recently published book, Souci de soi, conscience du monde, translated loosely as self-care, world consciousness, though it doesn't work so well in English. Others have drawn attention to the extent of New Age phenomena. Le narcissisme éclaté, the Californianized eclecticism, whereby talk of the spiritual replaces the religious. Liogier takes the argument further, positing a deep structure of contemporary spirituality. He proposes that the contrast between individualism and the mobilization of a global conscience is unwarranted. What he calls individuo-globalism is the creeping moral orthodoxy in which personal well-being and a care for the whole of the cosmos mutually reinforce each other. Within this overarching structure of sensibility, all manner of specific religious and religioid or para-religious doctrines and practices find their place. Not only Western Buddhism and yoga, but also the new style motivational training programs that have sprung up everywhere, holistic medicine, and the cosmopolitanism of a new elite that the French call bourgeois bohème, whose geographical mobility, and creative aspirations make them a kind of new ruling class. The mainstream theologies are affected too. In some liberal Jewish observance today, God has become the ultimate power for good. Anglicans infer that if God is love, as St. John's Gospel says, then the equation can be reversed so that love is God, while within Islam, the Gulen movement and neo-Sufi groups have shifted focus away from Sharia-based orthodoxy. As this spiritual culture gains strength, national boundaries come to seem arbitrary and are surmounted by various new transnational movements, from the evangelical NGO World Vision to Facebook. Traditional religious hierarchies lose credibility but fight back defensively, forming tight doctrinal lagers, such as we find in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, in Benedict XVI's reassertion of Vatican authority over refractory priests and nuns, and in Salafi Wahhabi interpretations of Islam. Conservative religious groups become smaller in size, resisting the trend towards a loosely freewheeling spirituality, but more rigid. If there is a problem with Liogier's so-called individual globalist model, it is that it risks becoming a catch-all explanation, all new data becoming grist to its mill, rather than a hypothesis open to falsification. But it is underpinned by the findings of the World Values Survey, which documents how post-materialist priorities come to dominate in societies where safety nets and the rule of law liberate citizens from concerns about survival. The Euro-American nations now face huge challenges to their competitiveness and to the welfare state. Maybe economic decline will lead to a proliferation of marginal cults, but also to the scapegoating and stigmatization of minorities that always result from threats to living standards. Globalism could go into reverse. One can detect advanced signs of this in the far-right movements afflicting Europe, and in the maneuver whereby some groups of the former urban working class, victims of economic globalization, adopt the rhetoric of oppressed minorities. National frontiers that were becoming relatively porous are stiffened, limiting the historic role of labor migration in mitigating poverty, whereas the movement of financial capital is hardly restricted. So lastly, my third theme, religious toleration. Racism, that is to say discrimination and oppression based on a social definition of race, is still widespread all over the world. But religious prejudice can be equally strong and is often correlated with racial differences. Anthropologists, as students of physical and cultural difference, can help to oppose racism by showing that it has no scientific justification. What can anthropologists in their capacity as students of religion do to oppose religious prejudice? On the one hand, no doubt, they can show how pronounced differences of religion can be masks for political differences. A classic example of this was the Northern Irish question, where the sectarian division between Catholics and Protestants was overlaid on the division between the earlier occupants of Ireland and settlers from the English and Scottish mainland, who were granted the northern counties with a built-in majority in 1921. The theological differences turned out eventually to be relatively insignificant, and among the drivers for a political settlement was a cooperative campaign by the churches of all denominations to persuade both sides to forswear violence and to put their trust in democracy. But on the other hand, those social scientists who would reduce ethno-religious conflict to a political struggle for land and resources are surely misguided. Religious differences can polarize nationalist sentiment through mutual anathematization and also through encouraging martyrdom. It is worthwhile to examine the theologies of competing religions and prepare a balance sheet of the extent to which they breed exclusiveness as opposed to the humanism which must surely in future be essential for the comity of nations. and which expresses itself in pro-poor humanitarian organizations where the traditional religions find common ground with secular moral values, values that in fact they helped historically to articulate and inspire. To start with Judaism as the matrix of the other two great monotheisms, Leviticus enjoins a morality that should be a model for modern nation states. As Archbishop Rowan Williams put it in a lecture given in Jerusalem in 2004, quote, "This is how a nation is meant to be living by law. This is how a nation is meant to be, living by law, united by a worship that enjoins justice and reverence for all, exercising hospitality, with a special concern for those who've fallen outside the safety of the family unit, the widow and orphan, and those who fall outside the tribal identities of the people, the resident alien, the stranger within the gates," unquote. This morality surely underpins the immense contribution made by Jews to all the humanities. One may speculate how different the world would be today if Judaism had become a religion of conversion, which might have been reconciled with the presuppositions of ancient Hebraic theology, rather than an ethno-religion. The actual historical outcome is that Jewish identity is a tripod with three legs: Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish religion, and the land of Israel, making it unique, since no other ethnic identity makes an analogous claim to three overlapping definitions. As for Christendom, the taste for persecuting heretics and infidels set in early, and in Britain we were burning bishops and witches only a few centuries ago. Though imported from the Middle East, Christianity provided legitimation for the unquestioning supremacism of Europe, while Jews were singled out for special oppression as a near enemy. In retrospect, however, we may trace a slow countercurrent towards universal humanism, provoked by the challenge of our encounters with what we now call indigenous worlds. Two outstanding figures of the 16th century were the missionary Bartolomé de las Casas, who was devoted to trying to secure better conditions for the Amerindians colonized by the Spanish, and the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who asked in his essay on cannibals whether eating a dead man's flesh was really worse than common European practices of penal torture. We may see Las Casas as prefiguring centuries of colonial paternalism, and Montaigne as prefiguring romantic primitivism. And Christendom also had to go through the Victorian stage of condescending belief in progress. But the modern approach to religion, influenced by anthropology, has now come to influence mainstream Christian theology and missionary practice. Christians today, notably the Roman Catholic Church, often advance the idea that Judaism and Islam, belonging to the family of monotheisms, are closer to Christianity than, for instance, Buddhism. But the structure of monotheistic cousinhood, as one may call it, is less pronounced and historically rooted than in Islam. Classical Islam espoused a specific concentric model of religious toleration, with Islam in the center, then a center of scripturalist faiths, given qualified recognition as dhimmis, people of the book, and an abhorred outer realm of shirk, variously translated as polytheism or paganism, and kufr, infidelity. Those Islamic scholars who still adhere rigorously to this structure of thought find themselves at odds with the principles of freedom of religion and respect for indigenous belief systems, principles that are endorsed by international organizations such as the UN. Yet it can be argued that when we examine the respective histories of Islam and Christendom, the Islamic concentric model used to afford a degree of protection to non-Muslims that the Christian churches withheld from their fellow Abrahamic faiths, thus making possible the persecution of Jews in Europe far more brutal than any discrimination against Jews in the Muslim world. Today it's an open question whether the concentric system, and in particular the rejection of shirk and kufr, polytheism and infidelity, are too profoundly entrenched in Islamic thought to disappear entirely. In favor of this thesis, Islamic civilization, for all its past brilliance, never produced a Las Casas or a Montaigne, who were able to imagine themselves in the position of Aboriginal peoples threatened by monotheistic hegemony. And it's hard to imagine today an Islamic counterpart to Claude Lévi-Strauss appreciating the contribution of polytheistic belief systems to our global cultural heritage. But against this thesis, Islam has shown immense flexibility in accommodating and indeed adapting to local belief systems, for instance in India and Africa. Arguably...
Time for the others, please.
Sorry, I think I'm within...
I'm sharing this.
I'm just coming to the end. I'm just coming in my last paragraph. Arguably, it's merely a matter of time before new, less purist interpretations of the foundational Islamic texts become widely accepted. Indonesia, with its famous mixture of religious traditions, provides a laboratory for testing the two theses against each other. I've skated over my three themes, and in conclusion would only suggest that it's part of the genius of great religions to give an impression of immobility while in fact changing rapidly. Those who invoke religion for causes of human engineering always find that it has unintended repercussions. We should guard against accepting a stereotypic view of any religions based on yesterday's knowledge.